to do a little presentation here, maybe 15 minutes tops, so that we can spend more time answering questions. I'll do the best I can with them. You're faced with a tough decision. It's going to have far-reaching consequences. I'm sure everyone knows that. A decision that could profoundly change the history of 5 communities, and it's not obviously something to be taken lightly. Though it's 3 years old, this is the most recent, the most up-to-date meta-analysis of the research on school consolidation. I would encourage everyone in the room to download it and read it. See the web address there. Not particularly filled with jargon or anything like that. Layman's terms, easy to read. The bibliography includes over 100 studies connected to school consolidation. It's almost as long as the paper itself. So if you have an interest in a particular topic, you can find access to further research in that bibliography. Now, as noted in this study, without question, there were gains made in early consolidations. With the advent of cars, trucks, and buses, schools were able to implement age-graded systems. They were able to add interscholastic athletics, build vocational programs, acquire specialized instructors. Most of these improvements were obvious to everyone, and thus no one felt particularly compelled to defend school consolidation. As I noted in the Norfolk op-ed piece that Bert mentioned, in the movie Hoosiers, consolidation was thought to be synonymous with progress itself. This is a powerful cultural assumption that still exists today in the 21st century. People tend to believe quite fervently that making a school bigger will also make it better. I've been the Dean of Schools of Education in 4 different states, including Nebraska, and I've seen the same phenomenon over and over again. Graduate students trained to become school administrators leave their programs believing with steadfast conviction that school consolidation is unequivocally synonymous with school improvement, if not progress itself. And there's something that's commendable about this, even admirable. They take very demanding jobs, sometimes thankless jobs, and still most of them keep a laser focus on the academic well-being of kids. But here's the problem. Contemporary research doesn't support the assumption that bigger is better. And I'm not talking about a study here or a study there. To quote the NEPC authors, contemporary research as a body and almost to a study has not recommended consolidation either to save tax dollars or to improve the outcomes of quality schooling. Now, at this point, the natural reaction is to ask, well, how could this practice go on decade after decade if there's no research that actually supports it? And this does happen a lot more often than you'd think, and I'm going to share 2 examples. In the field of economics, there used to be something called Say's Law. Say's Law. Jean-Baptiste Say is the guy who came up with this law. It's coined or captured in a phrase, production creates its own demand. Now, what this meant was that recessions were of necessity temporary. Say's law maintained that a recession could not go on indefinitely. Almost the entire group of economics professors in this country believed that this was true. And if you didn't believe it, you were labeled a little bit odd, or you were held at arm's length, not really a professional economist. Well, when the stock market crashed in 1929, Hoover was told by his advisors, his economic advisors, to sit tight. Say's law will eventually kick in. And of course it never did. There was no evidence that proved production creates its own demand, but this didn't stop an entire profession from believing it. A second example is It's called the Laffer Curve, named after the economist who dreamed it up. Laffer argued that if you cut taxes on the wealthiest in society, they'll like that, and so they'll work harder to earn more. Federal revenue will actually increase, according to Laffer, because a lower tax rate will be applied to all that much more wealth. Ronald Reagan used the Laffer Curve to justify huge tax cuts for the very richest in American society. The result was a huge loss of revenue to the federal government. The Laffer Curve was totally discredited. So you're probably beginning to get the picture here. 100 years ago, consolidation was pushed hard by the nation's leading educational spokesperson at the time, a guy by the name of Elwood Cumberly. Cumberly had served as a superintendent of San Diego schools, and then he took over as dean of the School of Education at Stanford. Exactly 100 years ago, in 1914, Cumberly wrote that the great task facing the nation was to, quote, urbanize the nation's rural schools, unquote. For Cumberly, school consolidation was synonymous with school improvement, and it has been referred to as Cumberly's Law. And ever since, school administrators have been trained to believe in that law. And if you don't, you're looked upon as a little odd, or you're held at arm's length, not really a legitimate school administrator. So this is how it happened that so much consolidation went on without much by way of evidence to support it. But this is changing fast. During the last 10 years or so, 5 different states conducted school consolidation studies: Indiana, Louisiana, Michigan, Montana, North Carolina, and all of them reached the same conclusions. Namely, this isn't saving money, and it isn't improving educational outcomes. Legislators in these states tended to back off their incentive programs for consolidation and say, if you want to do this, fine, but we're not going to try to coerce it. Louisiana went so far as to declare a moratorium on school consolidations as soon as they discovered that further consolidation was actually going to increase expenditures. It's not like this news was kept hidden. In fact, it was publicized in high visibility publications like Newsweek. You can see that. Consolidation's failing grade in Indiana. And again, it's not saving us money, it's not improving test scores, it's not working. The fact that this high visibility seems to have been virtually ignored in many states demonstrates the immense popularity of the idea that making a school bigger is going to make it better. In this respect, Nebraska is like most every other rural state, where the bulk of the population resides in a few large cities and suburbs. It'd be interesting to do a little experiment, go door to door in Papillion or Ralston or even Lincoln, and ask residents if they support rural school consolidation. Support for it is actually overwhelming in cities and suburbs because it doesn't affect them, for one, but also because they assume it'll make schools better and it'll save the state money to boot. The thought that both of these assumptions might be wrong, something that never has occurred to them. Never. Now, I'm going to do a little aside here and bring up Pete Ricketts. I've been told that if he's elected governor, he wants to try to implement a school reorganization policy that will result in one school district per county. And this is fairly typical. It's the kind of thing you'd expect from an urban businessman who thinks that business principles should be applied to every endeavor in life. That's not really the topic for tonight, but I would urge you to look to see where county-level school organization has already happened. You'll find those states are among the poorest in the nation in terms of student achievement and in household income. To quote the NEPC authors once again, in general, the more exploited or impoverished a rural region, the greater the apparent likelihood of county-level consolidation. County-level reorganization is for the most part confined to southern states. Southern states have been bringing up the rear in terms of school achievement for more than half a century. I find it difficult to believe that a gubernatorial candidate in Nebraska can in effect say, let's do it like they do in the South, and not have his intelligence questioned by anyone. But getting back to the issue at hand, so there's no data to show that test scores go up after a consolidation. So what do consolidation advocates use to make their case? Speaking generally, because every circumstance is different, the arguments tend to focus on class size. For there's a small army of educational researchers out there who conduct research in order to arrive at optimal sizes for a district, a school, and a classroom. And we can dismiss the arguments related to district and school size right off the bat because you'd likely have to consolidate 10 or 15 Northeast Nebraska districts to approach those numbers. So for rural schools, it generally comes down to trying to arrive at optimal numbers for classrooms. Well, let me state this as clearly as I can. There is no empirically defensible optimal class size in the literature. I'm not asking you to take my word for this, however, because this is not tough to figure out. Think of all the things that go into a teaching situation. The difficulty of the material to be taught, the quantity and quality of classroom materials and resources, the prior knowledge of the students, the distribution of academic ability among the students, the instructional wherewithal of the teacher. All of these and more would suggest fewer students or more students in a classroom, and they collectively mitigate against the idea of an optimum number. But regardless, if you feel strongly about making class sizes larger, is it necessary to consolidate 5 districts to do it? Would state-of-the-art telepresence options be a much cheaper and much less disruptive way to get those numbers? It's just a question. Another argument you will hear sometimes is that consolidation will enable greater curricular breadth. And this is ostensibly the mark of a better education. Well, let me quote the NEPC authors once again, arguing in favor of consolidation based on the assumption that offering a greater variety of courses equates with expanding opportunities for students is contradicted by the evidence. And here is some of that evidence. Again, you can find these studies and more in the bibliography of the NEPC paper. I want to mention the Berry and West study of school consolidation in this country, one that I mentioned in the op-ed piece in the Norfolk paper, as that study has had a huge impact. Berry and West are first-rate Ivy League policy researchers who took a look at 20th century educational history and were amazed at the amount of school consolidation that went on, particularly since they could find no compelling research that seemed to support it. So they set out to see if a century's worth of consolidation was a good idea. Now, they had a lot of tough decisions to make in order to do this task and do it well. For instance, could they rely on test scores or college-going rates, or would they need more evidence? And finally, because they're economists, and because economists like to measure everything with dollars, they decided in order to do the job right, they would need to get lifetime earnings. To do that, they had to study schools that were in session a lifetime ago. And that created another problem because a lifetime ago, very few women stayed in the workforce after the first child. Many never entered it at all, which meant they had to focus on males. And that's what they did. Once all those decisions were made, they set to work and discovered that graduates of smaller unconsolidated schools did go to college at a higher clip. They did complete college at a higher clip, and they did have higher lifetime earnings. Now keep in mind that there's nothing about the act of producing that research that allows the authors to say that future researchers will find the very same results when today's graduates retire. Their research nevertheless provides a little clearer picture of a policy that's been in place for decades, resting only on assumptions related to its merits. I want to turn now to one last line of research related to school district consolidation. Again, using the words of the NEPC authors. The influence of school and district consolidations on the vitality and well-being of communities may be the most dramatic result, if the one least often discussed by politicians or education leaders. Put simply, the loss of a school erodes a community's social and economic base and permanently diminishes the community itself, sometimes to the verge of abandonment. Economic development research will tell you that when a community loses its high school, it's game over. Any hope of future economic development is gone. Politicians simply don't care. It doesn't affect them, it doesn't affect their children, and rural people are too few to matter when it comes to votes. But why do education leaders intentionally do this to communities? My experience has been that the typical response is this. It's about kids, not their parents. I first heard this when I was teaching in the very late 1970s, and I continue to hear it today. I've always wondered how one can cavalierly separate what's good for kids from what's good for their parents. Never quite understood it. It turns out that there's new research which suggests it may, in fact, be very much about parents, and describing why takes just a little bit of explanation. As a group of professionals, education researchers have been baffled by a hard and fast correlation between household income and test scores. The lower the household income, the lower a student will score on standardized tests. Now, there are always exceptions, but this correlation has been amazingly strong decade after decade. And incidentally, small rural schools are the places that most frequently outperform what socioeconomic status would predict. But what is it about this tight connection, this tight correlation? Folks have tried to guess about this for decades. Is it a lack of reading materials in the home? Is it the greater likelihood of latchkey status, since the parents often do shift work and are frequently gone evenings? The very latest line of research seems to indicate that the largest variable at work may be parental stress. We like to believe that kids are immune to things like that. They certainly act as if they are, but not so, according to a new research trajectory begun by a Canadian physician and now being replicated at universities around the country. The preliminary data suggests that having stressed parents interferes with a child's ability to focus. In other words, children are concerned about their parents to the point that they miss important parts of lessons, setting them back academically. Obviously, financial instability is a huge contributor, the largest contributor to stress among parents. The thing that this research suggests to me most loudly is that anything and everything about kids is also about their parents. Damage to the community, damage to the economy of a community may seem as though it doesn't affect students, but the very latest research may suggest otherwise. Thanks for your attention, and I'll do my best to answer any questions you have.
Check back there, or maybe collect cards if you want to pass cards down for any questions that you might have. Mr. Theobold, we can give you a minute to think any of those up. Or if anybody would just like to ask a question. Yes, sir, here in front.
I have a series of questions for Dr. Theobold. As in your position, have you ever had the opportunity or the authority to credential future superintendents or
Yeah, I have. I was the dean of the School of Education at Wayne State for, I don't know, 8 years, something like that. 6 years. And we trained superintendents there.
So my next question would be, in your opinion, from what knowledge you have of the procedures that have been used in this 5-school merger, would you certify a superintendent to take the actions that these superintendents have been taking?
certifying them really is a matter of making it through coursework and and those kinds of things. And if they do that successfully, I would say this, that, and I mentioned this at the outset, that they truly believe what they're doing is in the best interest of kids. They're not doing it, as near as I can tell, and I don't know any of these individuals. I don't know if some superintendents are shared with these districts or not, or if there are 5 superintendents, or what the case may be. But I would say that I admire at some level their conviction. I just find that, again, I'll make the reference to the whole economics profession believed in Say's Law. And I think the whole school administration profession believes in Coverley's Law. Say's Law eventually was proven to be inaccurate. Coverley's Law is now becoming more and more clear, inaccurate. But what they did here, I don't know. I just couldn't, I don't know enough about it. Again, certification really is something that takes place at the university and not, not judging actions outside it. I'm sorry.
I suppose out of fairness to Mr. Theobold and the rest of everybody here in the room, which there are a lot more of you than when I stood up the first time, which is good. Did anybody check, are there any cards in the back? Just to make sure nobody gets skipped over in that basket there on the table, if anybody would just run out there and check for them. But if you wouldn't mind, when you do stand up, if you're, in terms of reasonable mediation or moderation and clarity, maybe just the town that you're from, so that the people in the room know. One of the biggest fall downs of the communication that I've seen is people don't know who's asking what, and then they have no ability to go back to their local school boards and ask some of those questions too. So I would encourage you to do that first and foremost. Talk to your local school board members as well. But anybody else have any questions for Mr. Theobold? It's got to sound. Yes, sir, right here.
I'm from Wassa, and we're having the meeting there, a 5-school meeting in like 10 days, I think it is. And there are 3 speakers going to be on. I'm pretty certain that they are all gun ho. Want more.
Okay.
I'm wondering if we could get you on the program, if you'd be willing to come and speak to the school board.
I am by no means an expert, and I have no authority to say any of these things necessarily, but the discussion, and I'll look to some of the school board members that I recognize in the audience. The idea there is there's one speaker from Northeast Community College talking about career technical education, which is kind of the idea. The second speaker is going to be from the Department of Education. Did I say that already? No, I said Northeast and then the Department of Education. Also talking about career technical education, but the bulk of the meeting will be a presentation by the 5-school committee's attorney from the Perry Guthrie law firm, who put together this packet that will be answering those types of questions. So it's kind of just an informational type thing, and they really do expect the attorney to take up. The way they were talking at the committee meetings is he could talk for hours and hours because it's a very detailed topic. Out of fairness to Mr. Theobold, I don't know if he'd be willing to come or not, but maybe another meeting would be better suited for that. And again, if you want to ask your local school board members to put him on and ask him to come later, please do. I don't know if you want to comment on that at all or put it to bed now, whatever you want to do. But I think, out of fairness, that meeting is probably booked. To the tune of everybody that knows the attorney that's going to be speaking said, if we wanted him to stay till midnight, he probably would. And so there will be opportunities for questions and answers at that meeting as well. So I didn't mean to railroad your question. If you'd like to ask him directly, you certainly can. So anyone else have any questions? There were no cards, I'm assuming? Are there any cards in the audience that need to be passed in that I can ask a question? Okay.
But I'm always on the complaint. I've been on board for quite a while. I've been part of school consolidations all my life with the effect of growing up in a country school, the fact that I understand small schools to a point, community. It's not an issue of, none of the boards want to close these, but for me personally, I look at the financial end of it, and just the trend in salaries. If you want to have 2 kids per class, I think the average, and don't quote me on the numbers, but I'm going to say our high schools right now, that half of the classes have less than 5 kids in the class. And the trend in salaries is going to be, we've probably got teachers in, and I'm not putting teaching, I mean, I support teachers, and I believe our district, Plainview, again, could be the highest base salary district. But the trend is that 3 to 5% increase, so we're paying some teachers in the 60 to 80,000 range. And if anybody can run the math pretty fast, it ain't gonna, in 10, 15 years, we'll have teachers making $100,000. And 2 to 5 kids, I just don't, I don't see the, so I don't know if you can just address that one issue maybe.
Well, I guess one thing I would ask is what the projections are for tax savings.
What was the question? Repeat the question.
Oh,
Well, I'm sorry. The question effectively came down to rising teacher wages and costs versus smaller schools. The comment was made that in approximately half of our classrooms at the moment, or classes at the moment, some of these are, I mean, you can look up this data for yourself, but the comment was made that in half of our classrooms there are 5 students or less, and with rising teacher costs and salaries, that becomes a consideration that needs to be looked at, a concern that needs to be looked at, okay? Is that clear?
well, one thing I'd say right off the bat is what the projected savings have been. Have you been told that there will be significant property tax relief as a result of this?
Again, the districts aren't, the fortunate thing, these 5 districts, they're not looking at it to save, you know,
Money.
they're not trying to sell it under the point, well, you're gonna save all these taxes.
Right.
It's about being responsible. We all in our businesses have had to do more, and I don't want to pick our people, but I could say this guy here, elevator-wise, they run more elevators in a bigger community than they ever dreamed they would. The livestock industry, you go down the line, we're all asked to do more. You know, it's just a reflection of what we're being paid and what we're asked to do, and then education is supposed to just have a high cost to it. I don't like it, but I just don't quite understand how the future is.
Well, I guess all I can fall back on here, given what you've said, is that it's not, I mean, I don't foresee any real change in the dilemma. I think it's going to continue to be hard to make, to make it work with small numbers. I mean, it just is. But has there been, I mean, what kinds of things are going on in these schools now related to distance learning? And are you familiar with telepresence technology? I mean, these are, a perfect solution for rural schools and to get, class sizes up or larger.
I have a question. I'm Sunny Daggas from Brookfield. Just wondering what class sizes are we talking about or what classes have 5 kids in, or 2? I mean, in Brookfield, I'm not aware of that. I mean, I'm aware of my daughter and my son taking calculus or upper level science classes that maybe only have 5 kids, or Lily's Cal class had 2. But those are, to my opinion, the perfect situation to have one professor through telecommunications teaching maybe 15 kids in the 5 schools. I mean, we geographically are so close that professor could travel to each school I just don't think that that's one thing I really think we haven't looked at is sharing our resources, maybe hiring that one advanced placement calculus teacher. And
Okay.
they teach to the kids that want that, and the schools share the cost of that.
Sure.
You know, I just don't think we've
Just
looked at those things.
in terms of sharing information, is there someone in the room from each school district that knows if you do have distance learning equipment or not? I know Plainview does. They all do. Okay. Just for everybody's information. I mean, we're staying as calm as we can. So, okay. Are there any other questions about anything?
Go ahead.
Oh, okay.
You know, I've been giving this some thought. I pay taxes in Plainview school district in Fall Spots. And, it always seems to be that the children have to move to a different location. I wonder if anybody's thought about having the teachers rotate on a circuit. For one idea, and another idea would be as to the small class sizes. When I grew up, we were in a country school that had one teacher who taught K through 8. That teacher was able to make a lesson plan for classes that had 1 or 2 students at each level, 3 at the most, and 0 at the least. And I wonder if there wouldn't be some type of program that has been tried somewhere that goes sort of retro, de-evolutionary a little bit, and teachers would be able to fit back into that mold that they do accomplish so much more
There have
in
been
small classes.
non-graded experiments with non-graded schools and things of that sort. And what you mentioned is entirely possible as well. I just say one quick little thing about this, because we get so focused on having too few, I'll just share with you our experience. We lived in Buffalo, New York, as Rick mentioned at the outset. It's a school district of 35,000 kids. A lot of them are being taught in buildings that are older than anything out here, and often those classrooms have 33 kids crammed into them, or even more. And if you were to say to one of those teachers, I'm going to give you the chance to come and teach in a classroom with there are only 6 kids in the class, or 8 kids in the class, they would think that they had died and gone to educational heaven. Seriously. The idea that anybody could complain about that from an educational quality standpoint would be ludicrous to them. So it's kind of all relative. I mean, this is what we know. We've got dwindling population, and it's a serious issue for us. And our focus is, oh, geez, if we could get more, if we could get more. But a lot of people who would like to be in our shoes, and I think we forget about that sometimes. Do you have a question?
I did actually find some in the box, I guess. There's a comment here about the study. I'm not sure which way this one goes, but there's a question about the studies being done, or the information coming from Michigan and Indiana. How can we be sure that this will generalize to Nebraska? I'm assuming that's a question about, is Nebraska similar to those states in some regards, or dissimilar under your expertise?
Well, I think that the thing that makes it a little bit generalizable is the fact that there's no other, option out there in the research. In other words, nobody has produced the study that says, if you do this, in a few years, your graduates are going to score better on ACT exams, and as a consequence, they're going to have better access to college scholarships and so on. Now, if that were the case, there would be a pretty powerful argument, right? But it's never been the case, and it's not going to be the case if this happens. I think that the fact that this has gone on in other states gives credibility to it. There should be a study in Nebraska done, but, you know, there hasn't been for quite some time.
Sure. Okay. The next question was kind of a longer one. What is your opinion on the theory that this merger gives our students more opportunity to obtain college credits, and is it advisable to encourage our students to give up courses like band and or choir to allow the time to gain an advantage to this jump start on college?
Well, I don't know what would give, you know, if you made it a single district rather than 5 districts, why there would be an edge in terms of dual credit options with other higher ed institutions. I mean, I've seen those options in, you know, very, very, very small schools. So I don't know why there would be an advantage on that score. The second part of the question is a little tougher. Seriously, I've been in the university environment now for a long, long time, and we see students come in, and if they've got some college credits taken care of, it can move them along faster into their major programs. So there could be an advantage if they know exactly what they want to major in. If they don't, which typically happens quite a bit, the advantage of the extra, or bringing those college credits in, begins to disintegrate a little bit as they experiment, you know, with various things until they find out what they really do want to major in. I am a big proponent of extracurriculars, music, theater, athletics, and it's a vital part of any high school education. And if it were my own kids, I'd be tempted. I mean, if they couldn't do both, I'd be tempted to say, just stick with the extracurriculars. That would just be my opinion.
Just for the room, I guess, and for Mr. Theobold, and again, open to correction here, the information that I have been able to come to and that has been discussed at these meetings is an education system built off of career technical education, which is more of a kind of a cloud-based directional program. Most of your schools, and here again, I'm not trying to sound like an expert, but I've been through some of these meetings. Most of the, and again, correct me, please, or if someone else would like to explain it, please do. I didn't come here to talk the whole night. But this form of education, which the Department of Education has been researching for a couple of years, would have the students pick a cloud of like healthcare or agriculture or industrial arts or something like that, and then they would tailor make their course path to hit that goal. At the committee meeting, they were talking about starting, I don't know how this is going to go across, but they were talking about starting the exploration of that toward the bottom end of junior high, maybe 5th or 6th grade, to introduce these kids to careers and those paths. And then in the middle, they would get into more specific, it gets more specific as you go. So by the time you're in the top end of the education, you're taking courses that directly are in line with what you would be interested in when you get out of school. So I guess my question, if I'm allowed to do that, would be, have you seen any other states or experienced any of these other career technical education moves, and have you seen any outcomes of those?
This is kind of a pretty current and trend that we're seeing a lot more of. Maybe 10 years worth of experimenting with this occupational clusters, and you know, I'm honestly, personally, I'm not a big fan of trying to make that occupational decision at a very early age. I'm not all that enamored with all of with those ideas, I guess I should say. But you know, I mean, keep an open mind. It could be a powerful learning situation.
The research, this question says, the research studies quoted on the 5-school merger website say that there are better outcomes, in quotes, for bigger schools. This clearly contradicts your study. What's the difference? What are the outcome measures, and how do grades figure into that?
Well, and I would urge anybody and everybody, again, I wonder if I could go back, I want to make sure that that's, that people at least have the URL for that, because you really need to take a look at the, this here. This is an analysis of all the research on career consolidation. So what those studies are, I have no idea. And you're absolutely right, that would directly contradict this. And these individuals, you can Google them, look them up, you can email them. What I did here tonight was rely very heavily on the existing research and the analysis of that research done by the National Education Policy Center. So I don't know what those studies are that they're citing, but it certainly doesn't, nothing that I'm familiar with.
Okay. For those of you that don't know, there is a website that was created that houses a lot of the information like that question that was just quoted. 5schoolfeasibility.org. Anyone willing to confirm that? I'd have to look it up myself quick.
There's a link from every school.
Okay, on the school, yeah, you're right. On the school websites, the individual school websites, there's a link to that in this cumulative website here. Yes.
What was that question specifically again?
Question was, the research studies quoted on the 5-school merger website state better outcomes for bigger schools. This clearly contradicts your study. What's the difference? And what are the outcome measures? And how do the grades fall into that?
I don't know about the study part of it, but if you look at the state testing, we're sitting in a town where I think for 2 or 3 years have scored higher. They've got like top scores in the state of Nebraska. But the problem is there's no correlation. There's schools the same size. They're scoring way down here. So to put that back together, I don't know who's going to study it, but if you listen to the governor in the talk, so then they looked at the low-income earners and stuff like that, and they've looked at the Class A schools and the Class B schools, and he's never found any correlation there either. So it's hard to see that, put that together, and that's just what's existed in Nebraska here for a while, on the testing.
Okay.
But nobody's done any studies and said, well, this is why this one's down here and this one's why. Creighton's been testing for 3 or 4 years.
That would be a fantastic question for the Department of Ed people and the Association of School Boards people on the 12th. That would be a great question for them, so save that card. Okay, what is being suggested to us is this new school with the help of Northeast Community College and the University of Nebraska at Lincoln. We'll be adding more vocational training to help prepare kids to work in local industries. Is it the public school's responsibility to prepare kids to work for local industries? Is vocational training in the 7 to 12 setting to eliminate college training appropriate? Are there seniors who are undecided? And how do we funnel kids to an area of training earlier? Shouldn't K to 12 be for foundational learning or for foundation?
Well, that is certainly my view. I don't think that there's anything wrong with some level of vocational training in public schools if kids are certain about what they want to do. I'll say again, I'm suspicious of these occupational clusters where they push kids into making a decision before they really know much about the ramifications of it, or especially if that would in some way sort of inhibit their ability to move in other directions. As far as particular training for the industries, local industries, I'm not quite certain what that is all about, and it strikes me as a little presumptuous. We don't know what these kids' aspirations are, and to sort of in some way prescribe some occupational niches strikes me as a little concerning. But I don't know planning are, one of the superintendents did phone me and said that they're working with Nucor or something. I'm not sure I understood that, or what it was all about. Norfolk, I know, does not need help. These communities need help. And so I don't know where the Nucor thing comes in, but in any event, trying to do things for these communities, I think is a good idea. I think that schools, from a cultural standpoint, they can do a lot. I mean, they can cultivate a sense of allegiance to your hometown. They can plant the seed. They can get kids to the point where they think, you know, after I go out and see the world and do the college thing and so on, I'm going to come back and start a business in my hometown. And if just one out of every 2 or 3 classes, one kid out of every 2 or 3 classes were to do that, it would make a huge difference. I think that that's probably the most important thing to be done, as opposed to specific job training for specific industries.
Have you, if I butcher your question, write another one and I'll read it the way you, if I see the same question come back up, I'll read it exactly the way it was. But what are colleges doing to maybe put teachers out into the workforce, equipping those teachers with the know-how for smaller areas? So I'm assuming this has to do with a college sending out a teacher to a rural area to help educate.
Well, not enough, in my opinion, and it's always difficult to negotiate these kinds of things, because as soon as you say, you know, a lot of these kids come from rural areas, want to return to rural areas, they want to teach in rural areas, they struggle. I mean, they struggle to teach, you know, with small numbers and all of those sorts of things, and there's things that can be studied. There's experienced teachers that they can learn from, and so on. But every time that you try to move in that direction, somebody is quick to say, but, you know, not every teacher is going to go to rural places. Some teachers some kids are going to want to go to cities. Some are going to want to go to suburbs. And so we can't be specializing to any great degree. So there's a constant struggle on that topic in schools of education. And, you know, to the extent that we're able to provide some experiences for kids to get them into rural schools so they know what it's about, we try to do that.
Has it been your experience that a merger such as this will draw people to our communities?
No. I mean, that's pretty clear. No. You know, and you saw what the NEPC authors wrote on that topic. We're all concerned about a decline in population. You'll have a decline in these communities if you do this. And I don't know exactly how important that is, but that you need to know.
The next card, and I don't mean anything, they may not be questions that you specifically would answer, but they are really good questions for the 12th and for your local school board. So I'll read them. If you feel inclined to answer it, please do. I've been told that if we do not do this merger in some form of consolidation, the state will step in and make any merger decisions for us. Is there any truth to this, or is this something the boards have been misled about? At what point can the state force anything or make it so difficult for us that we have no other options?
Well, you're getting close to school law here, but my experience has been no. There have been states that have stepped in. I know of no state that has stepped in to force rural schools to do anything. Some of you may know that in the state of New York, they basically took over New York schools. That's happened for lots of city schools. The government has sort of done this, but what would their argument be? I mean, you just said that one of the schools is one of the top performers in the state. So you're going to step in there and tell them that they're not doing it right? I think that that's highly unlikely, highly unlikely.
Matt, yes, sir.
Creighton, you've been doing this for a number of years. Can you give us any examples where you recommended to a group of schools, a concept school such as this, where you recommended that they do not consolidate, and they did not consolidate, and they're all 100% viable schools?
The short answer is no. It's a very powerful cultural force. I'm not kidding, and you could all do this. Go down to the suburbs, knock on the doors, and say, do you support rural school consolidation? You bet. Absolutely, I support it. Those kids, they have a right to a great education, get them into a bigger school. That's going to do it. That's going to fix everything. It's very difficult to stop school consolidations, particularly, once it's gone down the road a ways. And the times that I've been contacted for help, I take that back. There was one school consolidation, not a district consolidation, where in Minnesota, where I was asked to write an op-ed piece, and I was reluctant, but I did it, and they voted on whether or not this school consolidation ought to take place, and the vote came out in favor of not doing it. That's the only one I can really think of and point to. It's not that, this sort of thing happens all the time, year-round, I'm constantly contacted. But I am contacted somewhat, and of course, by people who really are concerned about losing their school, losing their district. And if it's way too late, there isn't much that can be done about it. Yeah.
Second part of that, then all of us have been doing our homework or trying to do our homework and studying, and everybody knows that the national average for high school is 750 students, and that's up from 300 in the 40s, okay? Well, all these studies give an optimum number of students. You said not for the classroom, and I tend to agree with you. If I could have 6 kids in the classroom, that's great. But there is optimum numbers in those studies, and those people also said there are optimum numbers in their studies. Did they not?
Yeah.
Generally, it's around 300 students per high school.
Or more, 400.
No, 300 is the optimum. And they say in small remote areas, rural areas, 200 is the high school optimum level. That's for teaching, not dollars. What's the optimum level that study said?
Well, this study will contend, as I do, that there is no empirically defensible optimum number. You're talking about for learning, you can get actually a little better traction on the optimal numbers from the other side, from the money side, in terms of the issues that you had raised earlier, sir. But again, there's all the circumstances are different, the conditions, the context, the buildings, the infrastructure, the resources. It just makes it too difficult to pin that down. Sure, it would be great if there were more students. I think that should be addressed positively. I think we need to be thinking about ways to make this more attractive. My wife and I, we have property in Pierce County. We intend to live there the rest of our lives. We're in the Pierce School District. But this is a wonderful place to live, and it's not only gorgeous. The people are decent, they're hardworking, and if you need help, you're going to get it. And again, having lived in other places, that's so valuable. And we intend to spend the rest of our lives in Nebraska, and we already consider, the residents of these communities to be neighbors. I don't want these towns to dwindle. I honestly don't. And again, I would say this, if you could point to research that says, yep, these kids are going to do better, definitively, they're going to do better, they're going to have higher ACT scores if you do this, well, then it would be one thing. But that's never happened, and it's not going to happen here. So you're creating a small school. Well, the 5 communities already have small schools. I don't see it personally.
As a little bit of an aside, the question having to do with the legislature, I have personally contacted both Senator Larson and Senator Sullivan, who is the chair of the Education Committee currently, and just directly asked both of them if there was any type of discussion, the committee discussing, has this been a topic that has come up? And Senator Sullivan's aide said, it's a local issue and you can handle it. And Senator Larson said, it's a local issue, you can handle it. I would encourage you to call them directly, because don't just take my word for it. And in fact, please do call them and harass them a little bit. They need it every once in a while. Maybe after tomorrow. But as far as I have been told, there is no grounds for saying that the legislature would step into any school district in Nebraska. The lady that I talked to said you've got, the only law she knew of was if there's 60 students or below, the landowners can choose to opt their land out of that district. I don't know.
They border another district.
Right. I don't know if I accurately represented that or not. So you need to call them. But the answers that I got from both state senators were, it's a local issue and you will be dealing with it. Okay. Yes.
You know, they probably won't, but with the state ed requires certain classes and certain teachings, you know. We have to teach X amount of math, English, the core classes. So indirectly, there's a demand on the schools to provide services.
Sure.
So.
Okay. Good point. Absolutely. Yes, over there.
You had mentioned voting at one time of the consolidations that take place. Are you aware if they were voted on by the people to consolidate, or were they basically railroaded into doing it by whomever, the boards?
Well, it has happened both ways, but it's pretty typical, especially more recently, that citizens are allowed to vote whether or not they want to go ahead and do this. I don't know if that's the case here. I don't know exactly what. I did want to say something about feasibility studies. Just because I've seen a trend, and this is just my experience, and I'm not going to say that whoever did the feasibility study here did it wrong or anything like that, but here's the thing. These are typically done by consultants who are school administrators, and they're trained to believe in Cubberley's law, that this is the way to do, this is the best thing you can do for kids, is to consolidate these schools or make them bigger. These feasibility studies are not blind reviewed, peer reviewed, sent out, names off, and check for, research methodology. I mean, this is what happens in higher education. A research study is going to have any merit, it's got to undergo that review process. These feasibility studies aren't, and they're typically, as a consequence, sort of a lot of confirmation bias, which means that the authors tend to see in the data what they confirms their beliefs about what's going to happen. So consequently, these are often very scary, spooky numbers that are generated. And most often, they don't come to fruition. I do want to say, though, that if the concern is population, that there are positive ways to do this, because consolidating is not going to help the population. It's going to hurt population growth. So.
The second question on that card, I'm sorry, there were other hands. If you want to do those first, yes.
I'm from Creighton, and I'm currently working on a research paper on the effects of consolidation on communities and student achievement. And I've found the same results that you
Yes, and there's a really profound example of just what you've described, and it's talked about and discussed. It's also in Indiana, not the statewide study, but of a consolidation that took place that resulted in dramatic drops for low SES students. So just exactly what you said. The thing about this particular consolidation is it's not going to create an ultra big school. So the possibility that those close relationships, which are what pulls those kids from low SES status into student achievement, it's the teachers who actually know them personally and care about them. To be fair, the school wouldn't be so big that those kinds of relationships wouldn't go on. But that's what is the phenomenon that you've seen. Those relationships are no longer there. Those students begin falling through the cracks, and it's very noticeable.
We've got about 20 minutes left. I hear rustling. If you do need to go, you can go ahead. We've got about 20 minutes before I was going to cut everybody off anyway, so if there's any more questions, please get them to me very soon. Otherwise, we'll handle this stack and be finished.
I just got a few comments. I'm a little bit concerned about the lack of transparency in this whole thing. And I'm a little bit concerned in one meeting I went to in Osmond, the question was asked, who makes the decision? Will it be voted on by the district, or who makes the decision? And the school board sat up there and said, we do. I don't know, back in the early 60s when we consolidated schools from the one-room schools to the towns, it was brought up to a public vote. And I don't know if the committee that has done this feasibility study has looked into how much this circle is going to shrink. This circle is pretty big, around 5 schools. But that circle is going to shrink, I'll guarantee you. I've got land 5 miles south of Osmond, my son lives there, and that'd be 7 miles from the Beer School or 20 miles from this new school. So where do you think they'll go? You answer. That's all I have to comment.
Okay. There was a second question on one of these cards. There was a second question on one of these cards, and I'll throw it out to the group because I think it should be asked at the November 12th meeting. I'll respect Mr. Theobold. I don't know if he knows the specific answer to this one. It says, why is Northeast pushing in support of the merger? What's in it for them? That would be a great question for the Northeast Community College person that's coming to that November 12th meeting. So I'll save you that question, I guess. After attending 3 meetings where it was very public that all 5 towns would have their taxes lowered even if a new state-of-the-art facility is built, has this really ever happened that you know of?
No.
Do you see any way, or how could taxes be lowered if the communities failed to exist and there was less and less revenue generated outside of land pricing?
Well, you sort of know the answer to that. It's pretty obvious. It's not, it's clear that this is not a way to save money. It just isn't.
A couple of questions. You actually answered a number of my questions during the presentation, but I had some very simple things like, have you ever seen a merger of this size? This amount of ground, this amount of property, this amount of schools altogether?
Yeah, this amount of ground, I can't think of any 5-district consolidation offhand. But you can go to some places in Texas, and there's some real big.
You can go to western Nebraska.
Yeah.
Might not have been 5 schools, but
Right,
land base is
right.
going to be much bigger.
So size of land.
Yeah.
Okay. Actually, I think the rest of them you answered. Well, the other question that I had here at the bottom was, during the consolidations that you've seen elsewhere and in the other studies, Iowa keeps coming up as like one of the model states for this kind of a thing where Iowa has consolidated a lot of their schools. Do you typically see the new school being built in a community or outside of a community?
Well, in a cornfield, that's typically what what happens. I mean, not always. It depends on the facilities that are, you know, involved and all that. But it's very typical to have, you know, a school out in the middle of nowhere.
Yes?
And I did want to share one positive, from the Creighton, one positive, relationship we have with Wausau schools, and we do share a teacher, in a retro way. She teaches, Spanish, Mrs. Rojas. She taught, my daughter early last year, she's a senior, she had taken 3 years of Spanish, and we wanted her to have 4th. And she was the only child from Bloomfield that wanted 4th year Spanish. Mrs. Rojas had, I think, a couple of seniors from Wausau that wanted Spanish, so she traveled. She travels anyway between the two schools. But she met the needs of Lily. She taught the other 2 girls from Wausau 4th year Spanish. And many times it was alongside teaching another level of Spanish in Bloomfield. Like Lily would be in Bloomfield, she'd be teaching Spanish 2 and Lily Spanish 4. I thought, oh gosh, how's this going to work? You know, how's Lily going to do? Because she wants to have a Spanish minor in college. She's at Boston College this year. She tested into an extremely high level of Spanish at a pretty good school. And so, you know, it worked. We were already doing things with Wausau, you know, sharing resources that way. And doing a good job, you know, so it's working in the small ways already. So, just want to say, you know, my siblings that are teachers, my sister teaches in St. Louis, my parents are teachers, teach at big schools. And I'm telling you, my sister put her daughter, who's a 7th grader, in a private school this year. She's going to have 500 kids in her 7th grade. She enrolled her into a private school my brother teaches in St. Louis, non-denominational, you know, not a religious school. She pays $25,000 a year for her kid to go to private school. Her class size is 50 kids. And she does not, it's not a residential school. She lives at home. $24,000 a year for her kid to go to school. And she's a public school teacher. So, I mean, small class size, and they're talking 50 kids. And we came to Bloomfield for a reason.
For a reason? Okay.
Yeah.
Right here?
Wausau, they say we can keep our elementary up. Is there a study that shows once 7 through 12 consolidate, what happens to the elementary?
Well, it's pretty common to have, to leave the early years in the communities, schools for the early years in the communities. There's always a little bit of danger. I don't know if you're familiar with what happened in Pilger as past summer. Well, they had kind of a middle school there, and now after that tornado, they're getting FEMA funds and so on, and insurance obviously to rebuild, but they want to rebuild that in Wisdom, not Pilger, which is to me, I just still can't quite fathom after everything they've been through in Pilger, to say we're going to use this opportunity to get the school over in Wisdom. So there's always a little danger. Another thing that happens from time to time that we've noticed is that schools will say, maybe they'll leave K-6 or whatever in the communities, but at some point then they may want to start a middle school. Say we're going to cut the attendance centers down to K-4 or K-3, so that we're going to start a large middle school. That happens. We've seen that happen quite a bit. So, for what that's worth, I want to say this kind of in keeping with the earlier remarks. There have been Americans who have gone through K-8 one-room schools and tiny class sizes in high school that have gone on to do remarkable things. I think of Norman Borlaug, speaking of Iowa, a lot of consolidation in Iowa, but he went to 8 years of a one-room school, and he had a graduating class of something like 15, and he's one of the world-renowned scientists. Or even here in Nebraska, if you think of Mark Sandos and Willa Cather, these people went to very small schools, and they're two of the greatest literary figures in Nobody said, we're not gonna publish this because we just heard there are only 6 kids in your graduating class. It just doesn't work that way. Nobody cares if you had 5 classmates or 500 classmates. It's what you do in life afterward that matters.
Yes, right there.
First, I have a question for everybody, and that is, when you were in 7th grade, for some of us, myself included, that was the no. How many of you knew what your strengths were and what you wanted to do? And the reason I want you to think about that is because part of the promotion for involving the technical college, and I am supporting associate degrees, bachelor degrees, as much education as you can get your hands on. Whatever you want to do is where you need to go. But, and I should back that up. I'm a 28-year vocational teacher, and now I'm a guidance counselor. So I'm also looking at it from the career education standpoint. And I am very much in favor of career education and opening our students' eyes to what is available to them. But if we start with the idea that in 7th grade we're going to start a cluster, so this person is more apt to have their skill and ability in a transportation or logistics or whatever career cluster in 7th grade, and then determine courses that they might take going on from there, I just don't think it's right to kind of assign a track, if you want to call it, to students at that young of an age, or freshman year, sophomore year. We don't know what talents the students are going to develop, what their interests are going to be. And after speaking with our foreign exchange students, who in Europe have experienced a lot of that, as far as by 7th grade they've decided if they're going on the track to go to work after their sophomore year, or go to a vocational college, or go on to get a bachelor's degree, then they are limited as far as their choices, and we all change as time goes on. So would you say that this, promotion of offering vocational courses to get them on a track is kind of what Europe has done in some cases, and the students that have visited with me about that whole tracking idea don't like it. They love how our schools offer opportunities to everyone.
Yeah, Europe is pretty big, but certainly several European countries mirror just what you described. That would be accurate, I think, fair to say. I agree, by the way. I'm all about, obviously, work is a huge part of life, and exploration into work options, I don't have a problem with that. Preparation for a particular work option, I think, is something you want to delay, a while until you're sure. So,
If we give just a minute here, do you have any closing comments you'd like to give about anything, or anything you didn't touch on that you'd like to? And then just one more thing.
getting back to the very first question, I don't know if it's in the cards, as Brooke said, about being at the November 12th meeting, or being on the docket for the November 12th meeting. I do want to help, as I indicated, we certainly feel very strongly about Nebraska. Of all the places we live, neither one of us are from Nebraska originally, though we're Midwesterners. I want to see Nebraska grow. I want to see Nebraska communities vibrant. And there are things that can be done by way of school culture, different kinds of activities that schools can get involved in that do reinvigorate, get students into the, to get a feel for what it's like to be of service to their neighbors. It's a very fulfilling feeling. And there are things schools can do to begin to nurture that early on and create that sort of allegiance, community allegiance. Community is tightly connected to the well-being of democracy. Scholars have been saying this since Cicero. and contemporary scholars Robert Putnam, if any of you are familiar with Bowling Alone. Bowling Alone is about the diminishment or the erosion of community in America. The title is significant because more people are bowling than ever before in this country, except far fewer are bowling in what? Leagues. And far fewer are involved in the Lions Club and Kiwanis, and the quilting clubs don't even hold up anymore. And there are just fewer and fewer local associations. And what happens is that democracy diminishes as communities erode, because people aren't getting together to talk about the circumstances that they share. That's what makes democracy strong, because when people are talking about the circumstances they share, things happen, things get done, and that's what makes democracy work. So the erosion of community in America is not a good sign for this country. And unfortunately, school consolidation has been a contributor to community erosion. It just has. So in part has left us where we are. Anyway.
Are there any advantages of consolidating, but still each school maintaining, each town maintaining their own school?
I don't know of anything quite like that. I mean,
When
they
you get
their own
the
high school.
internet and those types of classes available.
Do you mean in terms of like a unification, like we see this way?
Yeah.
A unification of schools instead of a consolidation into one bigger, is that what you're, okay? Do you know about unification of?
I'm not sure what this, I mean, when you pointed here, what is that?
There's if I'm the right way, I don't even know which way is west in here, but isn't there's a unified district? One, Vertical Clearwater Orchard.
They maintain their own schools, high school, all the way
Somewhat.
through high school.
That's gone, I think, Clearwater and Orchard are now together.
And vertical.
But, yeah, okay, so there's been some consolidation. Right, okay.
I'd have to know more about it. I don't know. I could imagine that there could be some.
One of the things that go ahead.
Sit down.
Yeah, if you want to. And my back hurts already. I don't know about you guys. So one of the things that I wanted to make sure everybody understood, and the school boards get this when I go to their meetings, and so we'll all get it now, or you'll all get it now. A lot of the questions that I read tonight, there are some answers for. I would encourage you to get on that 5-school feasibility website and look at your local newspapers. The schools have been very good about publishing the results of those committee meetings, and I know the newspapers just publish them verbatim. So if you pay attention to your local newspapers and get on that website, all of the stuff, the feasibility study is on there in its entirety. It's 600 pages long or something, but the committee has brought it down to, they've made certain agreeances that they're going to talk about this situation, this certain situation one way or the other. There's information in there about tax base. There's information there about estimated levies. There's information in there about class size projections 15 years into the future. And just recently, you know, there's this attorney study that has come out, or not a study, but information from the school attorney now that has information about how the new board would work, what it would look like for your teaching staff, what the ways of voting, either voting or the board deciding or this legislature stepping in. Some of that is in that information as well. So I guess my last thing for you is take advantage of your local school board members. Keep in mind, as Mr. Theobold was talking about, I just about ran over and hugged him real quick. If there's one thing that I think we have an abundance of in these communities is bowling leagues. We have quite a few of those actually. And so take time. What was the biggest discouragement to me when I was asked to do this was I was asked to do this kind of out of a fear of repercussion. I'm not the speaker, but don't be afraid of each other. We all live in the same communities. We all live here and work here. Talk to the people that you know. Talk to your school board members. Give them the benefit of the doubt that they're not out to hurt anything. They're out for what's best for all of us. So please make an effort to talk to them. Don't remain uneducated about some of these things, go to your school board meetings and to that meeting on the 12th, please. It's important. So, yes.
Yeah, Brooke, since you brought up several references, I started to dig into the Nebraska statutes on school law. Anybody can get to that by going to nebraska.gov, and then I think it's /schools/law. And now, I'm not a lawyer, but what I thought I read in there was that as far as consolidations or mergers between Class 2 and Class 3 schools, which I believe these are, it requires signed petitions from either 50, 55, or 60% of the voters. That's in the statutes. I don't recall the statute number, but that's one item that's in there that pertains to the situation we're in here. Another item would be quorums. What constitutes a quorum to do official business, and the location of where meetings are to be held legally.
And a lot of that, again, the explicit answers to those can be answered by the school board's attorney. That was the purpose of getting that person on board, is to give the communities those answers. So again, he'll be there on the 12th. A lot of good questions that can be forwarded to those people coming.
I got a
Yes.
question. Okay, we talked about class size stuff. In school. Are they taking in consideration, for the people that would be leaving the communities because it's right? And, there's gonna be teachers, their families, their kids that belong to the community, families that, don't like the situation, move out of the community. They probably work in Norfolk anyway. Let's move to Norfolk. Pierce, Crofton. Crofton is number 2 ranked in Nebraska state standards. You know, if they're against this big school, maybe a lot of people families sending their kids to Pierce or Crofton. So when they do this feasibility study, do they take consideration the families that will be moving or sending their kids? The kids who drive now, if they're in high school.
Yes.
Do they take them in consideration in the percent of the students that would be leaving to go to the different schools? Or the teachers, their kids?
I don't really want to speak specifically about the study. I mean, I've read it a few times, I guess. The important parts.
I've heard parents say that they're gonna.
And you're not alone. I've had parents come to me and say the same thing. I guess what I would encourage you to do, that there were estimates given from previous studies that were looked at in similar circumstances. You can take those for what they're worth. There were some projections in the feasibility study for some of those things based on information gathered from other consolidations. There was if one of you want to help me out, I see school board members from all communities in the room. Anybody want to help me out? I don't know that there was a specific number given, like a radius drawn around the town or anything, but there was some allowance given for students that would opt out on the very edges.
These towns are awful close together where it would be
Sure.
very easy to send a kid to Paris or Crofton.
And if you have concerns like that, again, bring them up to your school board members. So we're pushing on 8 o'clock. If you want to stay, I don't have any bowling balls or pins, so you're out on the bowling. But if you want to stay, talk to each other, ask Mr. Theobold questions for a few minutes. He's got to go, but we'll see you on the 12th.